Hi guys, this is Robin. Thanks for joining my webinar, History with Robin. We are going to be talking a little bit about the English settling in the United States today. I'm going to just give you guys a couple minutes to have some more of you join. And as a reminder, or if you're new here, if you have a question or there's something you don't understand or you want to ask me something, just use the Q&A box to type in a question, and then I'll try to answer it the best I can. The other thing is there might be an option to raise your hand. We're not using that option, so just type anything you want to ask me or say or tell me in the Q&A box, and I will try to answer it. And I see that I have a couple of questions. Oh, hello from Pakistan. Amjad, I hope I said your name right. And Abel, welcome. Lily, welcome. Julia, welcome. Thank you guys for joining me. And Jolly, nice to have you back. Okay, great. Spencer, Cohen, Shrishiti, hope I said your name right. Thank you guys all for joining me. Okay. Hello, Milo, welcome back. Hello from Mexico, Carlos. And Natalie and Nathan, hi guys. Okay, great. Well, it looks like a lot of you have joined, so we are gonna get started. So one of the things, what we're gonna talk about today is we're gonna talk about the English settling in the New World, in America. And I have a slideshow that we're gonna start. There we go. So this is History with Robin. We're going to be talking about the English settling in the New World. Let me just see if I can pull up some of your questions so I can make sure that Abel asked what costume I'm wearing. So this costume is going to be, we're going to talk about the settlement of Jamestown, which was the first the first settlement of colonists in the New World from England. And they came about a while after Columbus. And so I did my best to create a costume that looks like maybe a woman who would live in Jamestown, with an under, slip, kind of a jacket over the top, and a shawl, because it was kind of hard to live in that area and a little cold. So I want to make sure I stay warm. Okay, good. So here we go. So Jamestown. So in 1607, an English company, which was called the Virginia Company, started a colony in Jamestown, Virginia. Now, if any of you guys have seen the movie Pocahontas, then that is the company that they're following, those men who are coming, that's the Virginia Company. They had hoped to make money by finding gold. That was, gold and silver was their main reason that they wanted to settle in a new colony, but they weren't actually successful at that. Few of those men who came over knew how to survive in the wilderness or how to farm. And during the next 2 years, many of them died. So see if I can get some questions. Hi, Lila. Oh, good. I'm glad you guys have read some books about Jamestown. Okay, so on the 20th of December in 1606, 3 ships left England for the New World. This is the Virginia Company. These are these men who came over. They were called the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, which is actually an expression that people used to say to each other to wish them luck on a journey, and the Discovery. They reached Virginia on the 26th of April in 1607, and the journey took 144 days. So they were at sea for 144 days. Can you imagine what that would be like to be stuck on a boat with all of these people for 144 days? Be going someplace you've never been before? Um, about how many people traveled over to Virginia, Natalie and Ashley ask. The first group was 105 people. So after that 144 days on the ocean sailing, they arrived in Virginia. And then they traveled for about 2 weeks inland. So they arrived on the coast of Virginia, and then they went in, they hiked in for about 2 weeks, and they reached the place that would become Jamestown on the 13th of May in 1607. Oh, Milo, how great. That's funny that your birthday was on the same day that they reached Virginia. Spencer asks a really good question. How do historians know all this? Well, one of the things that historians depend on to be able to tell what happened in history is things that people at that time wrote about. So there was no email, no phones. The way that you could communicate with your family or with other people was through writing letters. So they would send letters back and forth. Another thing that people did at that time was they kept something called a diary or a journal, and they would write down the things that happened to them every day. And so then they'd talk about the things they saw or what they did. And they wanted to keep track of these things so that they could not only remember them for much later, but also pass on the information that they found to other people. That was a great question. Lila asked, did it take them a whole year to do it? No, it isn't a whole year, but it's about 4.5 months. So it would be like if we left today on the first day of April, and we spent all of April, all of May, all of June, all of July, and halfway through August, we arrived somewhere. So that's like a really long time. Abel asked a great question. A lot of them died. I'm not sure how many died on the way over on the ship, but I am going to talk a little bit about what happened to them when they arrived in the New World, because it was not easy for them to make a life. What food? Abel asked another great question. What food did they eat? They ate these like thin biscuits, like think of bread that you cooked really for a long time that is like a cracker, called hardtack. They probably packed some meat in salt to preserve it or keep it from going bad. And they probably had some different dry foods, things like beans or rice, so that they could have things to eat. That's a really great question. Cohen asked a great question. Why is it called Jamestown? And I believe they called it Jamestown after the king. How could they send a letter? Lily asked. That's great. They would send them back on boats. So maybe on the original journey, it was probably more people keeping notebooks and diaries to keep track of what they did. And later, when there were ships coming back and forth, they would write a letter. It would get on a ship, sail all the way across the ocean to the person that they were trying to send it to. As always, you guys are asking a million great questions. Ariana asks, how many kids were on the ship? On the first ship that went over, it was just 105 men. So at this time, when they sent these early settlers over from England, the Virginia Company only brought men, but women would follow later. Tuval, I don't know why we don't do that now in terms of writing letters or keeping track of history in the same way. Maybe that's something that you could start doing. It's kind of fun to receive a letter in the mail, I think. We have easier ways of keeping track of our information, you know, whether people write it down and store it on the internet or store it in their documents or things like that. Abel says, but I thought they hated the king. These first men that came over to Jamestown, they didn't hate the king. They were actually working on behalf of the king. Much later, there were people who came over who were looking for a new place to live. a way, you know, we'll talk maybe a little bit about the pilgrims if we get that far, who were not allowed to practice their religion the way they wanted to in England and were upset about that and came to the New World to find things. But these men who came over first were actually, what they wanted to do was they wanted to find gold and silver. They wanted to get these riches for the king. That was a great question. Anjali says, like granola bars. Yes, you are right. They would have food that would last a long time and wouldn't go rotten. Okay, great. Good. Oh, you guys are so great with the questions. So Jamestown, on 13th of May, 1607, they arrived in Jamestown and they settled it. So there is actually a museum that you can visit now in Virginia, which has created a copy of the Jamestown settlement and forts and other things so that you can see what they looked like. And I put a couple of pictures for you guys in here because I thought it was interesting, and I thought maybe you might think it's as interesting as well. So these are not the original ships that came over, but these are copies of the 3 ships that came over in 1606 and brought those 105 men to the original settlement in Jamestown. Isabella asks, we would like to know if any ships sank. I'm sure there were many ships which did sink, but these 3 made it across the ocean. I'm so glad you were able to join us, Isabella. Let's see, I keep freezing. Okay, hopefully that resolves itself, Lily. Yes, the king wanted them to go discover. Somebody asked, so the king pushed them over there, and also asked, did they mean to land in Virginia or was it random? I believe they did mean to land in Virginia because they thought there was gold and silver there. So they really wanted to discover that, and the king gave them permission and helped pay for their passage so that they could do that. Anyone who went to the New World and came back and had discovered gold and silver and brought all these riches was not only going to be very rich himself, but very famous. And a lot of the men who did that wanted that. Ariana, I haven't been there, but I really, really want to go because it looks like a really interesting place. Tuval asked, what's the museum called? I believe it's called the Jamestown Settlement Museum. And they have lots of, it's what's called a living history museum. I don't know if you guys have ever been to something like that, but I'm going to show you in the next picture. So you can see the houses and you can see that there's people there who are like actors who work for the museum. And it's a living history museum where the people who work there have jobs and they go around and they pretend like they lived at that time. So there is a job called a blacksmith, who is a man who makes things out of metal and makes the shoes for horses. So if you went to this museum, you could go see someone being a blacksmith and you could ask them questions and they would answer just like they lived in that time. So it looks like a really, really cool thing. Yes, Natalie and Ashley. Oh, that's really cool that your aunt showed you pictures of them. Arabella, this boat, one of them wasn't the Mayflower. The Mayflower was with the Pilgrims, which came later after the Jamestown settlement. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Did they have names? Yes, the names of the boat that came over to Jamestown was the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, which was just an expression that meant good luck on your journey, and the, let's go back because I forgot what the name of the other one was, and the Discovery. So those were the 3 ships, and those are just some examples of what they looked like. So here's, you can see that. Tuval, I don't think anybody died on those boats on the way going over, but there were people who died afterwards just because it was really hard to live there. Isaiah, I'm sorry, I don't know what the price of gold was at that time, but it was the main thing, you know, the main source of money, or the main thing that they traded. And kings and queens and people felt that having that gold made you really rich. So it was something they wanted. Oh, Lila, that's cool that you went to the Boston Tea Party Museum in Boston. In one of my later ones, I'm actually going to be talking about the Boston Tea Party and the Revolutionary War. So I'll make sure to include some pictures from that. And Isaiah, I'm glad you think this is cool. I think it's cool too. And yes, Anjali, there were slaves, which is one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later, which is obviously not a good thing, but I'll explain why they felt they needed to have them. So here's just some more pictures of Jamestown. You can see here on the left is two people pretending to be farmers, probably a farmer and his wife. And then you can see on the right, one of the other things they have at this museum is they have an Indian settlement, because where the settlers in Jamestown decided to settle, there was a tribe of Indians called the Powhatans who lived there. They're pretty famous, and you might know their Indian princess, her name is Pocahontas. So if you have seen the movie Pocahontas, you might have guessed that it's not a historically accurate movie because there's no talking raccoons and things like that, but that she did save the life of John Smith. That part is true. Oh, that's cool. About Aletta, about reading a book about Pocahontas in Jamestown. Yes. Kansha, sorry, I hope I said your name right. Did they know about diamonds? I think they did know about diamonds because people would have diamonds as jewelry. But I think mostly what they were looking for was gold. Okay, good. Milo, we might talk about the Battle of Little Bighorn later, but we're going to kind of move, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to move through history. Though I would love to talk about the Battle of Little Bighorn because I've actually been to that battle site, and that is the case. Okay, good. So it wasn't an easy life in Jamestown. There were many problems that the early colonists, so those men who came over to settle in that colony, faced. Food shortages, there was disease and illness. They had to establish relationships with the native tribes. And actually there were 14,000 of those Powhatan Indians around the area where those 105 men from England came and settled. So it was important that they established a good relationship with them. And also the colonists, they didn't really have the skills to settle the lands. They weren't necessarily farmers, or they didn't know how to farm in this new world. And many of the early colonists died because of those challenges. So actually for every 6 people who came to Jamestown at the end of 1 year of living there, one of those 6 people had died. So it was definitely not an easy life. And it had to do with a lot of things. It wasn't just one thing that caused those deaths. It was many things. Sometimes it was sickness or disease, or they didn't know how to grow food, or they didn't, maybe they were attacked by the surrounding tribes. It just was many, many things. Okay, good. Anjali asks, is Jamestown where James died? No, but they named it after him to probably impress him and set up as a memorial to him. So the survivors, so like 1 out of every 6 people died because of these hardships. Many of the survivors wanted to try to find something that they could grow and sell to England. In the beginning, one of the things that they sold to England was wood. They would cut down the trees that was around the settlement of Jamestown, and they would actually ship them back across the ocean to England, where the English would use that wood to build ships, to build homes, to build furniture, and to build other things there. It's kind of funny to me to think of chopping down trees and shipping trees somewhere, especially across an ocean. Excuse me, but it was one of the things they did. So, but one of the things that what the colonists ended up growing was tobacco, and they actually grew a lot of it. So if you were in one of my early webinars, we talked about Columbus discovering the West Indies, the islands of the Bahamas, the Caribbeans, and how they discovered that area. One of the things that they grew in the West Indies that the Spanish and the Portuguese brought back to Europe was tobacco, for smoking in pipes, mostly. And the people in Europe, they really liked that tobacco, but it was really expensive because Spain and Portugal controlled the supply of it. So they were the only ships that went down, got it, and brought it back to Europe. So they could actually charge whatever they wanted. Okay, good. I see I have some questions. Let's see if I can answer some of those for you guys. Anjali, yes, the slaves planted the cotton and helped work in the tobacco fields. You're right. So this was just sort of the beginning of why that got introduced. Kiosha, it's okay, you're just joining. We're talking about Jamestown, which was the first English settlement, the first colony that was created in the New World by the English, and it was settled by a company called the Virginia Company. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to find gold and silver in the United States and get rich and famous. Isabella, I saw that you raised your hand. Will you type your question into the Q&A box, and then I'll try to answer it? Isaiah asks, where did they find cloth? They probably brought cloth in the beginning from England, but then I'm sure that they grew animals such as sheep, where then they could use yarn and then turn that into cloth. Okay, you guys, such great questions. Tuval, why do people think that smoking was healthy, but they died younger? Well, at that time, they didn't have any evidence or belief that it was not good for you. I think that was before the time when people did that. Juliana asks, where did they find tobacco? They planted it. It's a plant, and they grew it. And then I think what would happen is when it got full grown, they'd pick the plant and they'd dry it and then turn it into tobacco. Lila, great question. What is tobacco? Tobacco is the plant which people smoke in pipes, and I think even cigars maybe, and in cigarettes. So it was something that people used back then, and they grew it in the West Indies. Another great question, did they ever run out of food? I'm sure they did run out of food. Another thing that they might have had to do was if they were low on food, they kind of have to stretch it out or make it last. Sometimes if you're making a soup and you don't have a lot of ingredients, you might add more water so that you have more, like a bigger pot of soup, but you've used up less food? That was a great question. Was it easier for them to grow tobacco, or did they just want to? Well, the men of the Jamestown settlement wanted a way that they could make money for themselves in Europe. And it turned out that growing tobacco was one of those ways. And the land where they were was good for growing tobacco. So sometimes in different places, certain things grow better than other things, like oranges grow well in California and in Florida where it's warmer, but oranges don't grow so well in Oregon where it's a little bit colder. So where they were in Virginia was a good place for growing tobacco. Wow, you guys have such great questions. Okay, let's see. Abel asks, wasn't tobacco used as money? I think people did use tobacco as a way to trade, or what we call barter for things. And that would be like if I had eggs and you had tobacco, and I wanted tobacco and you wanted eggs, we would trade for them. Just the same way that you guys probably trade for things with your brother and sister. Like, I have this candy bar and I want to use the iPad, so I'm going to trade you for it. Great question. Alaya, hope I said your name right. Were there already people in the West Indies islands, or did the colonists and slaves populate the islands? Well, there were already people living there. And that's why we got the name Indians, because Columbus believed he had reached the West Indies. And so there were people there, but the colonists did move into that area. Juliana asked, how did they believe that smoking was healthy, or how did they think it helped? I'm not sure they thought it helped, but it was something that they enjoyed, that they liked to do. I don't even know if they had any idea that it maybe was not great for your lungs. Okay, great. What Spanish tobacco? Abel asked, Spanish tobacco was just the tobacco, that plant that was grown in the West Indies. And I'm sorry, Valen, I don't have an actual estimate for how much they sold it for, but I do know that it was very expensive because they could charge whatever they wanted. Anjali asks, is tobacco blue? The pictures I've seen of it is it's like a brown because it's a dried plant. Okay, somebody asked a great question. Let me go up just a little bit. Arabella says, didn't they only make tobacco in America because the Spanish were selling it too expensive? Exactly, that is exactly right. So this Spanish tobacco was really popular in Europe. But the Spanish people, the Spanish traders and the Portuguese traders could charge whatever they wanted to. They charged a really high price because it was in demand. People wanted it and they had it. And they were the only ones who had it. So, sorry, I skipped a slide here, guys. So the colonists in Jamestown decided they would grow tobacco. Then they'd sell that tobacco to England. And then England would sell that tobacco throughout Europe at a cheaper price than Spanish tobacco. So that was their reason that the settlers of Jamestown started selling it, was they wanted to do that. So as a result, the Virginia tobacco became really popular in Europe and was the first crop, the first thing that the colonists grew that actually made them money. So who was this man who came up with Virginia tobacco? Sorry. His name was John Rolfe. He was actually the husband of Pocahontas, the Indian princess who saved John Smith's life. And he helped figure out what this plant that would become Virginia tobacco would be. Okay, good. So there is a problem about growing tobacco. Many workers were needed to grow tobacco, and that caused the start of slavery in the colonies. Tobacco plants required a lot of care, and there weren't enough settlers to take care of them. So in 1619, Black Africans were brought in to work in the tobacco fields. The first of these people brought in were actually allowed to buy their freedom after working hard for several years. But as the settlers started to grow more and more tobacco and the farms got bigger and bigger, the idea, and more slaves were brought over, the ideas about buying their freedom changed. And by 1670, those men and women who came as slaves to Virginia were going to be slaves for life. So that was a very not good effect of that. So a little bit more about life in Jamestown. So what kind of trade, and this is a word that means business or way of making money, happened in Jamestown. So we had men who were farmers who planted and grew food and tobacco like we just talked about. There were also carpenters, men who could make things out of wood, so building houses, churches, all different kinds of shelters that they needed, as well as fences. A bricklayer, who is a person whose job it is to take bricks and build a wall or build something, also building buildings. A mason, which is someone who builds or carves things out of stone. A tailor, a man who makes clothes. A barber, so getting your hair cut, men getting a shave. Sometimes they also acted as doctors in the past, and a surgeon. So those were some popular jobs. Let's see if there's any other questions. Abel asks, how did they know about the Africans? I'm not quite sure how that started. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's possible that you could do some research on it and find out. Okay, oh, sorry, I missed one. So Jamestown was a colony of men in the beginning, at least. So the first 105 colonists who arrived in Jamestown were only men. So the Virginia Company in the beginning sent only men over. But about a year later, in 1608, in October, there were 2 women who arrived. They were Mistress Forrest and her maid, Anne Burris. Most of the women who followed came to be with their husbands. So maybe if their husband traveled over before them, the husband would settle and get a house and get started, and then the wives would cross the ocean to be with them. Or they were women who came to be personal servants to the other women. Abel brings up the point that it is possible that through the different trade routes, these English men learned about the possibility of slavery. And I think that's very true. Okay, good. Natalie and Ashley asked to see the popular jobs, so I'm just going to go back for just one moment so they can see those jobs. Those were carpenters, bricklayers, masons, all people who helped build places where they could live, and tailors, barbers, and surgeons. Later, they brought people over who were doctors, people who made medicines, blacksmiths, so that they could build things out of metal, and put the metal horseshoes on their horses, and many, many other people. Okay, good. So that was life in Jamestown. So then after about 14 years after that first wave of people came over and the colony had been settled, about 90 more women arrived to be wives for the tobacco planters and the farmers and the men who lived there. And then this is actually a typo. So it wasn't 550 women arrived the next year, only 50 women arrived the next year. So those would be women who were coming across to be with their husbands or to marry one of the men that was already there. Let's see. Arabella asked, did they get the choice to go to Jamestown? Yes, they had the choice to go to Jamestown. There might be many reasons that a woman would want to travel to Jamestown. Maybe she wanted to have an adventure. She wanted to explore new things. Maybe she didn't have any family in England, like if all of her family had died and there was no reason for her to stay, this might be a new place to go. But they definitely had the choice. It was their choice. Were the slaves paid at all? I don't believe so, because that's sort of that is a definition that we talk about slavery, is where your work is owed to someone else, where you work without pay. And so you're not making any money. Okay, so let's see. So even though the Jamestown settlers never reached their goal of finding gold and silver, they did make a home for themselves in the New World of America. And then after that, many other English settlers came later. I'm sure you have all heard of the Pilgrims, correct? Anjali, thank you. I'm so glad you love my costume. I love it too. Love to wear costumes. Okay, so here we go. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the Pilgrims, right? So a pilgrim is someone who goes someplace for a religious reason. In US history, the people we call the Pilgrims were being treated badly in England because of their religious beliefs. They were not able to pray or worship in the way that they really wanted to in England. They were not allowed to. So they decided that they wanted to come to the New World and have some freedom to believe the things they wanted to and practice their religion the way they wanted to. So in August of 1620, they left England and they set sail on the Mayflower for America, for the New World. A couple more questions about Jamestown. Would the men have the choice to go to Jamestown? Brittany, I think many of them did have a choice to go to Jamestown. It is possible also, if they worked for the Virginia Company, that it was part of their job to go, that they had to go. If the colonists came for gold and silver and didn't find any, then why stay? It's possible that a life in the New World, even as hard as it was better than the life that they had at home. And I think a lot of them hoped to find gold and silver, and they hoped that that would happen. Right, so we have these pilgrims, these people who decided to come to the New World for religious reasons so that they could practice the religion they wanted to. So I know you guys like numbers. So there were 102 pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower, and it was not an easy journey. The ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean during a season of storms. So during the time period when storms were happening. So many of the passengers were so seasick that they couldn't get up. And there was actually a story about the waves being so rough that one person was swept overboard. I'm certain that person probably drowned. Melanie, that's so cool that your family had at least 9 ancestors on the Mayflower. That's a really cool thing to know. But it was not all bad. And there was even a baby who was born during the journey. His name was Oceanus Hopkins. They named him Oceanus because Oceanus is the Latin word for ocean, because he was born on the Atlantic Ocean. There was another baby born on the Mayflower, but it was when they had already landed and were waiting to go off board and settle in their new home. See, you guys have some more questions. Juliana, that's so cool that you're related to Christopher Columbus, and I actually don't know how many people died on the way over from the Mayflower. And the pilgrims also had a lot of trouble surviving at first, and many died of disease in the first winter. But they were friendly with the native Indians who lived around them, and they helped them learn how to grow food. There's actually a really great book, if you're interested in knowing more about this, which is called Squanto, Friend of the Pilgrims, which is a really great book that talks about how the pilgrims were helped by those around them. The next fall, to give thanks for their good harvest, they shared their feast in what's now called the first Thanksgiving. So that is a little bit of the background to that holiday. They were so thankful that they survived. Though I believe I read somewhere there that there were only 38 of them, 38 pilgrims who survived. So from 102 to 38, that can give you an idea of how hard it was. We are just about out of time. Awesome, Lila, that you read that Squanto book. I really love it. It's really a great one. So after the settlement at Jamestown and the pilgrims on the Mayflower, many other groups of settlers came to the New World as well. This map shows all the areas where different settlers came to live, and we call these areas colonies. And all these colonies in the beginning belonged to England. And this is the beginning of what we call the United States today. So you can see that they're all the way from what is Maine now, but was part of Massachusetts. You know, that we have the New England colonies, the middle colonies, what we call the Chesapeake colonies, and the southern colonies. So those were all settled and all belonged to England in the beginning. I think Oliver says, some people were pilgrims who came on the Mayflower who just came for an adventure. It is true. While many of them came to have the freedom to practice their religion in the way they wanted, there were some who wanted to come to the New World as well. And Jolly, yes, Chesapeake Bay, that's why they called those the Chesapeake colonies. They were based on that. And Mariah, yes, those are what we would call the 13 colonies. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me. I'm so glad to have you guys join me for this webinar. I hope you learned a little bit about Jamestown and the early English settlers who came to America. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you guys have a good day. And I hope to see you in the future at some of my other webinars. Okay, bye.